have the systems in place that attract inbound investment because of CPTPP, because of EU coming up, EU-Vietnam, because they are jumping to the top of the ASEAN tables in many respects. Again, it's, they were towards the bottom before, they're moving quite sharply. And I think if you are not doing that, if you're not putting your own domestic house in order, if you're doing backwards policies like making it more difficult for foreign investors, making it more difficult to export, making it more expensive, if it takes you 3 years to get a permit to build a factory, who's going to relocate to your country? If you're making it more expensive for you to ship things out, who's going to relocate to your factory? So you need to think about, if you have really backwards, like India keeps thinking they're going to do well out of this, and I'm really? If you have really backwards policies on e-commerce and digital trade, why would I go there looking to the future? I would not. So surprise, surprise, nobody's going. Why? Because the policies are backwards, difficult, and can change in an instant. This is not the kind of stable environment where an investor thinking forward wants to put down new roots for the future.
Okay, thanks. Lots more to ask about, and we'll maybe get the audience to help with this. Professor Todo, so going back to your Jackson Pollock painting, which is spectacular, really. This research collaboration issue has exploded as a topic here in Washington in the last few months. I mean, it's been around for years, but it's become a very hot topic with a lot of conversation, including one here a couple weeks ago that we had in this room about, including with the provost from MIT and some national security experts, talking about this question of maintaining an open environment in our universities and our laboratories for research on the one hand, and the benefits that provides to us, but also, the real national security risk, the risks that arise from that, from a lot of sources, but including researchers who are taking knowledge back, and sometimes it's feeding into less positive, non-commercial, and more national security worrisome areas. So getting that balance right, very difficult. Is this a conversation that's happening in Japan? And are you having a discussion in your university or in other universities about these issues? And how are you trying to strike the balance? And then related to this, what are the implications for trade and investment patterns in the region? Big questions, but if you could give us a quick answer to that.
Quick answer. First of all, in Japan, actually, it's been debating. For example, in universities too. So now, I think in the Japanese universities, if I want to invite, for example, Chinese scholars, I have to, write many papers to get approval. This actually hinders research collaboration, I think. And I think, again, innovation is very important, and research collaboration is a very important channel of knowledge diffusion, which promotes innovation. Learning from your research partner is completely legal, basically. Again, I want to emphasize that we need rules, explicit rules. For national security or whatever. Research collaboration should be under explicit contracts, and then the contract should be, specified. So that's, I think, very important. For this, to promote innovation. Thank you.
Okay, well, again, it's a huge topic, and one we may invite you back to talk to us about more, because it's really of interest to us here at CSAS deeply. So, Professor Tu, your presentation was understandably somewhat dark, and often when we get to the topic of U.S.-China trade issues, we have the same conversation here with different perspectives, but ultimately it's a pretty dark conversation. Can you give us any light? Is there anything in either regional or global trading, the regional or global trading system, where there is actually an opportunity for the U.S. and China to cooperate, collaborate, to get something positive done beyond the purely bilateral issues that we're struggling over? Is there something on the international or regional agenda where the U.S. and China have a clear, aligned interest where they could work together?
Well, I'm sorry for my pessimism.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah, actually, I've been always optimistic, but now, yes, it's changed. Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, actually, even multilateral discussions are based on bilateral negotiations. Like right now, actually, members, at least in the WTO, members are proposing to implement some reforms. China has delivered its proposal on WTO reform. And actually, some points in the proposal are responding to US requests on so-called structural reforms. So in this sense, we are cooperating. But as a whole, for the WTO, now the key problem is the functioning of the dispute settlement mechanism. Members, including China at least, pay a lot of attention to that. We believe this is a basis for the enforceability of WTO rules. If big members don't follow rules, then why we make rules? So this is, I think, a big dilemma in the WTO reform. Now we are waiting for the proposal of the United States. The US has complained about dispute settlement a lot, but has not submitted any constructive ideas about how to improve this system. Then I think China and other members are suspicious of the value of making new rules. Even in the ongoing negotiation on electronic commerce, we also have this concern. So, I mean, we have, I think we have a lot of expectations on the United States to play, or how to say, to get back its own confidence in itself and its belief in international systems, to follow the rules made by or led by itself. So anyway, I think it largely still depends on the United States. Yes,
okay.
We're looking forward to
Well, thank you for the boost of our self-confidence. I wrote about that a couple weeks ago, and I agree with you. I think a lot of this is a problem of our lack of self-confidence, and we need to restore that. So that might be a start. Okay, this is where veterans of the this forum will know that we now bring you into the conversation here. In front of you, you should have one of these very expensive, I'm going to stress, very expensive items of hardware. And I say that because if you take it out of here, someone is going to come running after you, and that we will find you. So do not take this away. These are clickers which have 5 buttons on them, well, actually 6 buttons. The first one that's most important is to turn on the orange button at the top to turn the power on. We will then be given a series of questions on the screen, which are multiple choice questions, and you can push, that's last year's result. We should not quite yet put that up. Okay, great, if we can get full screen. So we need a question first, and we're going to have a question. You can push any one of these buttons. You can push 15 times, it won't make any difference. You'll only get 1 vote, but vote often, vote early. You'll get 1 vote. We will get results here in real time of the audience view on these issues, and then we will talk about it up here. And then later we'll have you able to ask questions as well. So does that make sense? Everybody understand? So turn on your orange button so you get a little green light at the top, and then we will put up the first question. Yuka, I think, is doing this. If we could put up the first the first question. There we go. Which of the following initiatives related to economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region has the greatest momentum now? CPTPP, RCEP, AEC, or BRI, Belt and Road? We'll give everybody a minute. Please do vote. By the way, these are anonymous. Nobody's going to know who voted for what. So please do vote. We always find that some people are shy, but it's okay. As usual, we always get somebody who votes for E when there is no answer E. So that's fine. There we go. We deliberately don't put up, in most of the questions, we don't put up other or, none of the above, because that's too easy. We want to force you to try to say what you think is the best answer. Okay, so it looks like we have at least a plurality here, if not I guess it is a majority, in favor of CPTPP. That's interesting. Start with you, Deborah. Why is the audience right? Is this the initiative with the most momentum right now?
So I think it depends on, I voted yes, CPTPP. We've been working on this forever, so yes. I think it depends on where you sit, though. Obviously, if you're in or potentially in a country that will or is in the CPTPP, it matters a lot to you. If you're in a country that will never join it, then obviously it matters less to you. So I think it's one of those where you stand depends on where you sit. Because if I were in a country that will never be in CPTPP, or at least not in some foreseeable future, then maybe I would vote for BRI, because I would say, well, maybe that matters more to me. But in Asia, in terms of momentum for integration, especially for the things that I assume people in this room care about, CPTPP is probably more interesting because it's more about integration. And so I think that's why people are voting for that one.
Okay. Does that surprise you, that result? Professor Tu? No, doesn't surprise you? Okay. Belt and Road scores pretty well. We're going to have some questions about Belt and Road, so we can pause. So if you don't have comments, we can move right along to the second question. Okay, is this the second one? In 10 years, which of the following initiatives will define Asian economic integration? Same 4 initiatives. Again, your favorite choice. Don't press E, please. Come on. Give you another second here. Okay. All right. Again, some people are not voting because I count there are way more than 85 people in this room, which is roughly what the numbers are up there. So please don't be shy. Okay. So I'm going to ask Professor Todo, why is CPTPP scoring so well? Without the United States in it, is Japan, as it did in getting CPTPP done, going to be able to push others into the agreement, push it out further, or what do you think explains this view, or is it just skepticism about the other ones, maybe?
So first of all, I'm very happy to see this result. And I'm very happy to hear that China is already interested in joining CPTPP. And so in this question, actually, asking about Asian economic integration, not Asian Pacific integration. So I'm not sure whether U.S. is included or not. But hopefully, in the end, the U.S. will also join CPTPP. So we will have a complete RCEP-like or FTAP-like economic integration in Asia. So I'm not sure. Actually, looking from Japan, I was more, pessimistic about the CPTPP, but here it seems that, people are more supportive to TPP, which is a very good news to me.
Good. Again, might be skepticism about the other ones, but and we are going to ask about BRI in a minute. But Professor Tu, can I just ask you, 10 years from now, will China be in CPTPP?
I hope so, yeah.
Prediction.
Prediction. Yeah, possible, I think. Yeah, yes,
It is possible.
yeah, it is possible.
But seriously, it's possible, but it's got pretty high standards. I mean, on things like state-owned enterprises and some things that China would find difficult to meet today.
Yeah, but now, like, the principle of competitive neutrality is accepted by the Chinese government. So, I mean, Chinese people are always adaptive and pragmatic. So, if they are really important and beneficial for us, we can adjust our principles.
Okay. All right. Deborah, did you want to?
Well, I've always found this a bizarre argument. If Vietnam can do CPTPP, then China can certainly do CPTPP. I mean, look, if it's a political will discussion, and if the Chinese government decides they're going to do it, they're going to do it, and it's not that complicated. I mean, even the SOE provisions, with all due respect to my colleagues who negotiated it, who were in the room, the SOE provisions have a giant loophole at the outset, and I would argue that as a result, I just define everything as a public good and I move ahead. And so, I mean, I think this is fixable. That's what I would argue. So I think China could absolutely come into CPTPP without necessarily wrecking the agreement as it is and add a boost to it. Now, will it be complicated? Yes. Would it be complicated for the U.S.? Of course, which is why the Chinese are thinking about it now, you know.
Okay, I challenge the next panel to ask what the implications of that would be if China were in CPTPP 10 years from now and we're not. The United States is not. What would that mean? Okay, let's move on. Actually, just pause for a second. Do we have last year's results? I just realized that I think we had last year's results. Yeah, this is last year, so it's a similar result. We'd ask the same question. Similar, although RCEP did a little better last year than this year, which is interesting, because it's supposed to be the final year this year, right?
This is it.
Interesting. Well, we'll see. Every year we've been saying RCEP's going to be finished this year, right? So, okay, this is it. All right. We'll hold you to that next year. Okay, next question, please. To BRI one. Yeah, BRI is, and then you can read these. I'll give you a minute to read it. It takes a second. It's best, no, you can't do multiple answers. I know it's difficult, but you have to pick what you think is the closest to the truth. I'm going to give you an extra few seconds because it's a lot to digest there. Again, I know there are more people in this room than have voted, so please do try to vote. It helps us get a little bit more scientific response here. Okay, but there seems to be a fairly clear pattern here, though it's not a majority, a plurality feel that it is creating a new Sino-centric economic architecture. Versus the other end of the spectrum, I guess, is probably C, that it's a waste of money for China, at least. So, Professor Tu, not to put you on the spot, but do you think that this is a reasonable judgment by the audience?
Well, I think BRI is beyond Asia, right? So. At least to my, I mean, even in China, BRI is still a difficult issue. I mean, it's difficult to understand. So I don't think, I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand this initiative. But to my understanding, I think BRI is more about infrastructure. So this, of course, is from China's own experience. We believe that infrastructure is critical for economic development. And China has this capability and maybe excessive capability in infrastructure building. So the Chinese government wants to, you could say, play a so-called responsible stakeholder role in the world to help other developing countries to develop their infrastructure. Of course, China has its own benefits, its own intentions, like to, especially to export more of our construction materials and equipments. But I think it's also beneficial for the countries under this initiative. But I don't think the purpose is actually to create so-called Sino-centric economic architecture. It's not like a system or architecture. I would say the Chinese people, at least right now, we are not so good at constructing architecture or systems. We are good at construct infrastructure, these visible things, not the invisible rules or something like that. So, and also security. As I said, BRI right now at least is already beyond Asia. So I don't see the connection, actually, clear connection with so-called Asia security dynamics. It's mainly a development aid mechanism. This is my understanding.
Helpful. Professor Todo, I mean, infrastructure, if this infrastructure is built, widely built across the region, historically that has had a pretty significant impact on trading patterns, on actually bad things as well, like, the bubonic plague famously, was carried by rats across the Silk Road. So it carries, good and bad things. But what would you, if there is a kind of significant new infrastructure map in the Asia-Pacific region, what do you think that's going to do to trade and knowledge, which you focused on in the region?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but I would like to mention that, so Professor Tu mentioned that BRI is a kind of a development aid. And one of my studies found that Japanese aid actually on infrastructure actually promoted foreign direct investment from Japan, not from other countries. So obviously, infrastructure aid can be a channel of foreign direct investment and trade. And also, it could influence political system in the recipient countries. I'm doing a lot of research in Ethiopia, and I saw a lot of infrastructure has been built in Ethiopia by Chinese aid. So then I can see that politically also Ethiopians are pretty much looking at China and trying to follow the Chinese system. So, despite of Professor Tu's statement, I think infrastructure aid can pave the road towards like a political architecture, and also trade, of course.
Interesting. Well, another topic that we are very interested in here in Shameless Advertising Department, if you haven't been to the microsite that we run, reconnectingasia.csas.org, please go there and you'll see a map of this region and 14,000, I think, and counting infrastructure projects in a database behind that. So we're doing a lot of work in this area, to be continued. So next, actually last year's results, do we have that? If we just flip them around. Okay, so definitely there was more sort of sense last year, even that this was going to lead to Sino-centric patterns of economic activity and be potentially impactful on the security dynamics. Interesting. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Back to trade. What is the most likely impact of Trump administration trade policy in Asia? So make sure your thing is still on, because sometimes it goes off if you haven't been using it for a while. Make sure the orange button's pressed. So more balanced trade, more protectionism. Again, vote early, vote often. Okay, well, there's a pretty clear trend, unless we have a sudden surge for E there. No. Come on, guys, be bold. All right. Start with you, Deborah. Do you think that's right? Is the U.S. out of luck here?
Well, I think that that is true, but I actually think that the more alarming part is actually B, which is that the more the United States shows that it's okay to flout the rules, the more Asia thinks it's okay to flout the rules. So we, sitting in Asia, are spending most of our time, when we're not dealing with this trade war thing, dealing with nonstop problems and challenges in Asia that we would not have had to deal with before, which is countries that are putting up tariff barriers to one another, countries that are putting up poor digital policies to one another, countries that are engaged in a lot of behavior that they probably would not have done in the past if they thought that the rules still mattered and if the sheriff was still in town. But with the sheriff gone and the rules in doubt, we are spending an enormous amount of time dealing with countries in Asia, in particular, that have decided that protectionism is okay or that changing the rules domestically is okay, because what difference does it make?
Can you give one example?
Well,
how about Vietnam and digital rules?
Actually, Vietnam is, I mean, they have some, problem. I mean, there will be companies who say, wait a second, Vietnam cybersecurity is a big problem. But actually, I would argue that in the digital space, Indonesia is a particular challenge. So we are literally on Tuesday doing another workshop in Indonesia on, they're doing many things in Indonesia, but one thing that they're about to do is break the WTO customs moratorium on digital products. And so we're doing another workshop to help small businesses who are Indonesian understand why this matters to them, because then they can go argue to their own government why this is deeply problematic to them, because they're going to have to pay duties, they're going to have to do paperwork, they're going to have to pay taxes on imports of digital products like software, music, books, etc. And this is deeply alarming if you're a small business who has to rely on external products, and is much more alarming when the other parties do the same thing to you. So now you want to export your music, your software, your whatever, your apps, and everyone else has put up the same barriers to you. So we are spending an enormous amount of time on these kinds of things. So customs moratorium, backwards digital policies, data localization issues, e-commerce challenges. The digital thing is most of our time is actually in digital and in, of course, supply chain changes. But the digital part is deeply problematic because they are nonstop. And then new tariff policies that keep coming into effect, new standards that come out of nowhere that are WTO illegal. But again, who cares, right? Because the U.S. doesn't care. We're going to lose the appellate body. So, it's a free-for-all. And I would say in the long run, protectionism in the region is, I think, the bigger threat.
Okay, lots more to talk about that, but do we have last year's? This is the last question that was the same as last year, I think, and then we have 3 new ones. But let's see, last year, so similar results, but the protectionism one was a little higher then. Interesting. Okay, next question, please. We just got 3 more. We're going to try and whip through those and then bring you into the question and answer. By the end of this summer, U.S. and China negotiations will have Oh, there's one brave soul who's voting for a comprehensive agreement. You want to show yourself? No? That's all right. No, that's okay. 2 people. There we go. Is that you, Professor 2? and me. Okay. Anybody else? Keep voting. Keep voting if you haven't. All right, but we've got a pretty clear trend again here. So we're predicting an impasse. Okay, we're at an impasse, so that's maybe too easy a question. That's the status quo, I guess. Nobody thinks there's a possibility that Trump and Xi could decide to get this over with and shake hands and do a deal. That's nobody's going to raise their hand to support that idea, but how about at least a Buenos Aires type of solution where they agreed to a 3-month negotiation to get this done in 3 months? That seems more possible, right, Professor Tu? That they could agree to that?
Yeah, probably. But it would be more difficult than before, I think, because now the Chinese government has stated its 3 red lines. I mean, before this, actually, the Chinese government has had more space to make a deal, make more concessions. But right now, the red lines have been set, so it would be more difficult for China to make more concessions. But then it depends on whether the U.S. government would like to accept these red lines. But I think it's
Can you just tell the audience quickly what the 3 red lines are? Just to...
The first one is to cancel all additional tariffs. Second is the import commitments should be reasonable. And then the third one is the agreement should be equal, fair, something like that. There are some flexibilities in these 3 red lines, but still there is less space for the Chinese government. But one thing is, it seems that the U.S. administration really loves tariffs. So it's then it would be very difficult for at least the first red line. It's very difficult for the U.S. government to accept it. But that red line is, I think, the clearest red line for China. So then I also choose C. But yeah, that's one or the 2. Okay, I'm not one of them.
All right. I'm sure there'll be questions and discussion about that, including in the next panel. So let's move on to the last 2 questions. So there's a Japan question, basically same question. End of the summer, U.S.-Japan, deal, no deal? Keep voting. Again, the trend lines are pretty clear here unless we have a surge of the right answer, which is D. But C, interestingly, Professor Todo, there seems to be thought that there will be a deal as soon as this fall. Do you think so?
Yeah, I'm not very sure. I wish I could choose A. But again, I actually saw many Japanese were opposed to TPP, just a few years ago, and many Japanese, frankly, are very much afraid of U.S. How to say, multinationals or whatever. So I'm sure that if the negotiation is going on, then more and more Japanese are worried about the U.S. and also they will be against the trade agreement.
The reason I'm not sure about how a trade agreement in goods alone gets done is that implies that what that means is that Japan is going to give the U.S. the same agricultural access that it gives other TPP members. That's what the U.S. really needs, and then the U.S. is going to reciprocate in some way by giving Japan, the kind of treatment it gave to autos and auto parts in TPP. But the latter requires Congress to approve that change, and I just think once you do a congressional review of this, it's going to take a heck of a lot longer than people think. But that's my view. So again, lots more to talk about there. Maybe there'll be questions. Last question, and this is for you, Deborah, I think, which is who's next for a bilat? Who should be next for a bilat?
Should be next.
Okay, that's just the first person voting. Don't worry. We can still. Who should be next? Yeah, there's an E this time. But only if you really think there's another country. You have another country in mind. It's not a cop-out to say, no idea. The word should maybe opens up some, discussion, but Deborah, do you want to take a quick stab at that, and then we'll let people weigh in?
Yes, but this is going to make me very unpopular. My answer would be, why would anyone sign an agreement with this administration,
Why?
especially...
We don't have a why on here.
especially after Mexico. Like, why would you do that? What is it worth the piece of paper that you've just signed, when you can have it upturned or thrown out in an instant, in a tweet, in the middle of the night, and everything you just worked for is no good? I don't understand why anyone would line up to. I've always thought this was, puzzling to begin with, but particularly, if you weren't paying attention and you somehow missed that, Mexico, over this migration business, should have said, like, holy cow, why on earth would I do such a thing? And so if I were any one of these countries, I would say, wow, okay, I'm going to go through very painful domestic political reforms that are going to be demanded of me by the United States, which I will agree to do for I don't know what reason, but whatever, I will do it. And then at the last minute, for what? So, who should do it? From the U.S. perspective, everybody. The U.S. should be doing, agreements with everybody because they're losing credibility. But, then who would be the counterparty to that? I don't know.
Okay, we're obviously going to need bigger clickers next year so we can get a Y on here. All right, thank you all. That was great. We're not quite done because I'd like to invite the audience to come in. There are microphones that will be brought to you if you raise your hand, and then please do be concise. And we might take a cluster because we don't have a huge amount of time. So there's a gentleman there. Do I see any other hands? Think about it. If you have a question, I'll take them in a cluster if we have others.
Do you mind if you could stand up?
Thank you. Well, thank you for the presentation. I'm coming from Ecuador, so we don't have a trade agreement with any of the countries that once mentioned here. But I want just to take advantage of your experience. So in terms of inclusive development for these countries, for example, Vietnam, that you have mentioned a lot of times, so what of the models is better? I know that it's not a univocal answer that you can give to us, but just to have an idea, for example, the RCIP or the CTPP, which is better in order for having the internal normative changes in order to develop countries? Thank you.
Benefits for the countries that are signing on for their internal development. Okay. Does Ecuador want a bilateral FTA with the United States?
No, but I think we are the only country that are struggling to have these negotiations. So thank you for your advice in this case.
All right. Okay. That's anybody else that we can cluster it? If not, does somebody want to take that on? Which of these approaches is best for the country's internal development?
So that's a great question. The reason why we do trade is not because we're so interested in trade itself necessarily, or trade agreements because we like trade agreements, but really because we think it's that there's no silver bullet for development, but trade and trade agreements get you closer than anything else. So that's why we're enthusiastic about trade, and we like trade agreements because they help anchor in commitments that are important. So you can do lots of things unilaterally. You don't actually need a trade agreement to do the right thing. You can just do the right thing. But for reasons that I find a bit puzzling, many countries have forgotten that unilateral action is allowable, and you can just do the right thing because it makes sense. So many countries are holding out now for a trade agreement as the mechanism for them to do sensible, smart things. Okay, so in that environment, what kind of trade agreements make the most sense? it's the more painful ones tend to be the higher quality, higher ambition agreements, but they also tend to pay off more. And so that is why we particularly need Vietnam to be successful out of CPTPP. Because if you can show that CPTPP, high quality, high ambition, deep commitments, 600 pages of rules roughly, thousands of pages of schedules, actually delivers results in Vietnam, that is super important, because then everyone says, well, then that's worthwhile. I should sign on to that kind of agreement. If Vietnam doesn't do well out of CPTPP, which I don't think is going to happen, thankfully, but if it doesn't do well, then people will say, why would I sign on to these super complicated agreements? I should sign on to the sort of much more flexible, lots of, policy space kinds of agreements that give me the ability to do whatever I feel like doing whenever I feel like doing them. And the downside of that, of having extra flexibilities, extra policy space, especially for developing countries, is the point of an agreement is to signal, especially to companies, that this is the environment in which you will be operating. You're reducing risk and uncertainty. You want to create, I would argue, an environment that is more stable for companies so that they say, okay, I know what the rules are. They're unlikely to shift in the short run, and so therefore it makes sense for me to invest, to plan for the long run, to do the kind of expensive development that matters, rather than short projects or whatever that could go, could leave, whatever. So those require, I think, higher quality, higher ambition commitments. And if you need to anchor them in a trade agreement to get the domestic political will to agree, sometimes it's better to blame it on someone else. I didn't really want to do this to you guys, but unfortunately my other partner, they made me do it, so what can I do? I have to impose these painful reforms domestically to satisfy these guys. But the end result is you get a much better economic environment for your firms and for foreign firms who want to come in and invest and build jobs and so forth. So that's what I would suggest. Higher quality, higher ambition. Doesn't have to be in a trade agreement. You can do it on your own because it just makes sense to do it. But if that's politically difficult, then signing an agreement with someone, and at least then the good news is, assuming you can get the agreement done, you can then blame them for whatever the challenges are. We would have loved to have protected you forever, but sadly those people over there are making us do this, and the net result should be, hopefully, enough economic growth with some redistribution policies domestically to solve the problems.
There is or was, Professor Tu, in China a debate like this about the usefulness of these agreements, including specifically TPP. There was certainly in 2013 about the benefits of joining TPP to help drive the domestic reforms that China needed to do anyway. Is that still alive, that sense, or is there now a sense that that's not that useful to China?
As I said, we still think it's necessary to have some foreign pressures to push forward China's domestic reform. Because actually since the year of 2008, domestic reforms have been to some extent slowed down in some aspects, some difficult aspects, including SOE reform. Even earlier, I think, when the United States decided to join the TPP, in China, there already was a discussion about joining TPP, or at least promoting our domestic reform faster. So yeah, I do think that that is necessary, especially for politically sensitive and difficult issues.
Okay. Are there other questions, or people just really want to get to break? Okay, you had a question before. Can I ask Ito-san there? And then the lady behind, and then we'll stop.
Thank you very much for an impressive presentation and comments from all of you. And I have a question for Deborah-san. You mentioned that the supply chain has not been really affected in the short term, and I agree with that. But Department of Commerce has expanded the entity list, and there was a presidential decree on 5G, and there's also aircraft, pharma, and now Chinese government is also trying to make their entity list. So my question is, how do you think those regulatory change and the compliance risk will affect ASEAN governments and industries. And from U.S. perspective, in order not to push away ASEAN companies to Chinese side, what's your suggestion?
Interesting. And let's take the woman behind Ayumi. Yeah, there we go.
Hi, my name is Piper Campbell. I worked on U.S. ASEAN policy through the end of last year. So I have two ASEAN-related questions, one for Ms. Elms and one for Mr. Tu. I'll do Mr. Tu first. It's simpler. My question for you is it more in the Chinese government's interest to work with ASEAN as the ASEAN architecture, or to actually splinter ASEAN and work bilaterally with the countries of ASEAN? And then I'm kind of showing my hand a bit. So Professor Elms, my question was a little bit led by one of the slides, which pointed to the possibility of there being greater ASEAN Asian economic integration with the U.S. left out. And I wondered whether you're seeing within ASEAN, as a result of the U.S.-China trade tensions, sort of more focus on ASEAN integration, or in fact, if some of the tensions and some of the differences among the ASEAN countries are growing in this space. So for example, the very different approach that a Vietnam, or different benefits that would accrue to a Vietnam versus a Cambodia, whether those sorts of things are coming to the fore more. Thank you.
I think we will do both, right? Depending on specific issues. It's also the case in China-Europe relations. We have a very close relationship with the EU, but also we're developing bilateral relationships with individual EU states. Then, as I said, it just depends on specific issues.
Some great questions. So I said that tariffs themselves, no one wants tariffs. So we have hundreds of companies right now at USTR complaining about the next list of tariffs for good reason. So no one likes them, and they would prefer not to have them, but those are manageable. The entities list is a different thing entirely, because that is not the normal thing you're used to dealing with. And the sort of complete rupture of being able to do business is something else entirely. That is not normal, and companies, I think, are not sure even how to handle this. This is a totally different environment. Well, how do we adjust? Can we adjust? How do we need to do it? You know, that's a very different animal. And some of the regulatory changes can be more complicated, actually, than the tariffs. I mean, at least with a tariff, you know what it is. It might change at this point in an instant, but at least you know what that is and you know how to deal with that. The regulatory changes can be more complicated because you don't always know that they're coming, you don't know how they'll apply. The compliance costs for regulatory changes can be higher than a tariff change. So the regulatory changes are the kinds of things that really could keep companies up at night, and entities list especially among them. Is this changing in ASEAN? Definitely. I mean, one of the things that should be noted is that for ASEAN, in fact, all of Asia, China is now the #1 or #2 import and export market for every country in Asia. So if you're going, and then I would say this is a final nice point, if you're going to make Asia choose sides in a trade war, you know, this is getting awfully complicated, and the more that you ask countries to make decisions and choose sides, the harder it is for them to choose, and you may not be so happy with the way in which they end up choosing, because the end result is, these are countries that are in the neighborhood, and do you want to be happier with the country that's in the neighborhood or the country that may not be in the neighborhood? This is not something that governments are excited about, I would say. No matter where they fall on the spectrum, this is really unpleasant. And trying to get a win-win outcome, which Asia always loves, is almost impossible at a time like this. So if you can't get a win-win outcome, this is, how do you navigate this really shifting environment is not easy. And so for ASEAN in particular, are they finding more fragmentation? At the moment, I think no. the longer this drags on, the more fragmentation they may have. But at the moment, at least, it looks like at the ASEAN level, not as much fragmentation as you might think. A little bit more integration, because the chaos is causing them to say, wow, maybe we should focus on getting a few deliverables that make sense. RCEP in particular, that's the key deliverable, I think, for ASEAN/RCEP this year. And then after that, as this drags on and gets more complicated, you may see different splits. You already see some new challenges in ASEAN itself. The TPP countries, non-TPP countries, the ones who are benefiting from the ones who aren't, the ones who are more tightly connected to BRI and China, the ones who aren't. I mean, there's a lot of new challenges that ASEAN has not addressed, has not faced, and how they resolve this is really an interesting question. So for people who have watched ASEAN for a long time, I mean, it's not always been the most fascinating place to study, but actually suddenly it's become much more interesting than it used to be, because it's now being buffeted in ways that it wasn't before. And the rhetoric that we're going to survive this buffeting is now like up against the, really, are you going to survive it, and how? In-your-face sort of challenge that it didn't have to deal with before. So it's kind of interesting, and I suggest that some of you who weren't paying attention to ASEAN might actually start to pay attention to it, because it's gotten far more interesting.
Okay, well, I heard challenges and chaos and unpleasant and various bad things, but I also heard opportunities and integration and interesting and good words like that. So let's end on those happy words. Before you thank the panel, let me just say two things. First of all, there's a break now, and up on the Sam Nunn Terrace, there's coffee and I think edibles as well, snacks. And so please enjoy that and be back here at 11:31. And second thing is, do not take these with you. I'm telling you, you take them with you, Eri Hirano is going to come running after you, and she will find you. So do not take that with you. But now join me, please, in thanking this terrific